In hindsight, this is my story. It may not be inspiring or helpful, informative, or amusing. It is sometimes embarrassing and inconvenient. It will be about blame, shame, regret, and guilt, and anger. Lots of anger that eats into my days, directs my moods, and interrupts my relationships. This is my truth as I see it, as I remember it. I will start by introducing my third child of four, a second son. He rushes into the world and leaves too soon. He departs at 46 years of living his life. I remember his age, but I do not remember the date. He was the same age as the notorious Rob Ford, mayor of Toronto. They died within 3 weeks of each other. They shared at least two passions, football and their poison of choice, vodka. My story starts in the early 1980s. I was still impacted by the tattered remnants of the 60s and 70s, which hung in the air and caught me in the sticky web of self-absorption, self-love, and selfishness. The mantra of those times was, if it feels good, do it. And I kept doing it. Ken was 14 and at home with his brother and two sisters. His father and I were on a month-long vacation to South America when he had his first attack of pancreatitis. This is a disease that inflames the pancreas and, among other things, results in debilitating pain. His older sister was 19. She took him to the hospital about 45 minutes away. The four siblings chose to keep this from us so that our vacation was not abruptly interrupted. Being in the mindset I was at the time, I appreciated that decision. Hindsight is a nightmare. The children shared this news with us when we came home about 2 weeks later. When his dad and I spoke to the doctor, and he told us it was a pancreatic attack. He also said pancreatitis was an alcoholic's disease. He said that because Ken was too young to have experienced many years of alcohol abuse, it was unlikely to be the cause, and suggested that he had scar tissue on the pancreatic duct that may have resulted from an internal chicken pox. When Ken was 2.5 years old, he had a severe case of chickenpox, which lasted for a good 10 days with a body temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The pox invaded his mouth and therefore may well have been on his internal organs, the doctor surmised. Of course, the scarring could also have come from a hockey stick injury when Ken was speared with a stick in a hockey game. Once again, hindsight is a bitch, and the knowledge I came to have made me fear when I carelessly carried him. Did my casual drinking and smoking cause this? Ken was not perfect. God knows he had his faults. I don't want to turn him into a saint. He wasn't that. There are some things I wish I didn't know. He was always in a hurry. In hindsight, I wonder if he had ADHD. He was always busy. He was always doing something. He was always going somewhere. In hindsight, perhaps he knew he had a short time to live a big life. I confess that in his preteen and teen years, I was not an attentive mother. Like some women of my generation, I was building a career. I had entered a profession that was male-dominated, and I enjoyed the success, the compliments, and the recognition that a suburban housewife was suddenly granted. I was loving it. I was very self-absorbed. When Ken had further attacks of pancreatitis, probably exacerbated from experimenting with alcohol, he went on his own to the doctor at the local strip mall near where we lived. The doctor never consulted with us, and Ken never conferred with us. So began his dependence on Percocet. He was very good at concealing these visits, and as I said, I wasn't paying attention and my focus was on my career. The years passed. Ken married, had 2 children in quick succession. He became successful at whatever job he had, became bored quickly, and moved on to something new. Shortly, he had a difficult, contentious divorce and succumbed more and more to his illness through more self-medicating to relieve the pain of the pancreatic attacks. In hindsight, I wonder if he knew he was making his situation worse. He never had trouble getting prescriptions from various doctors, and occasionally added a number 1 or 2 in front of the quantities he was prescribed, or even a 0 behind. Pharmacists never noticed the script for 100 that should have been 10, or an order that 15 that should have been 5. Nobody noticed. Where was I? After his divorce, he tried living on his own and failed. He came to live with his dad and I, and so began our real relationship. Ken made his own nest. He rarely, if ever, complained. He was the first to acknowledge his part in his destruction. He knew who he was. He knew the sins he had committed, and he made no excuses or complaints. He was doing pain penance. He knew it, and I knew it. I felt he was paying the price for both of us. I should have been a better mother. I began going to his doctor's appointments, and it became apparent that he was on self-destruct. His children came to an age where they wanted to live with their dad, so his son came to live with us, followed by his daughter 2 years later. Ken often told me, "This isn't what you signed up for, Mom." He was right, but it was an opportunity, for now I had the chance to know my son as an adult and watch him parent his children. In hindsight, it's some of the greatest memories of which I am grateful. He taught his protesting daughter how to change a tire in the rain. He made sure we took her to every cadet event. Ken played football all through high school and a recreational league, and he wanted to share that passion with his son, but it didn't take. In wanting him to have similar experiences, Ken then suggested rugby. This captured his son's interest. Now Ken had to figure out rugby and become an expert. He exposed them to hobbies and activities that might interest them, and he shared his love of cooking with them. When I say his love of cooking, I should say he exposed them to baking, cooking, preserving, dehydrating, barbecuing, and flavoring. This was Ken. If he was interested in it, he needed to know everything about it and would research a topic for days until he mastered it. This focus he passed on to his son. Because of Ken's dedicated research of the current activity, whatever it was, his kids had the best equipment, the best exposure, the most immersive experience he could provide. These were their teen years, and it was sometimes discordant for us all. Ken's illness was a deep bass note always drumming away in the background, always affecting the mood of the household. Despite the constant pain, Ken was still trying to live life large and took time to coach football at the local high school. Pancreatitis is devious and has many complications like liver and heart issues, diabetes and neuropathy, not to mention the toll it takes on your mental health. Ken had it all, and there were many appointments and disappointments. We all deferred to Ken. Our days revolved around his schedule, and our daytimer planner was frequently consulted to avoid conflicts. We as a household were all affected by the thick atmosphere of Ken's struggles and self-administered, not often medical, solutions. By now we were joined in the house by my eldest son. After my older son came to live with us, he also had need to see a doctor, and Ken's doctor was available. My older son smokes cigarettes, drinks copious quantities of beer, and has asthma. The doctor admonished his behavior by saying he should know better, as his brother was a poster child for what not to do. This seemed callous, tone-deaf, and unnecessary. Ken was his patient, not an example. Could I be angry? Could I be left not trusting the medical expert caring for my son? Could I be disillusioned? Ken was now being treated for his addictions. His doctor withheld pain medications, sent him to Alcoholics Anonymous and Homewood, an addiction treatment facility. He became an addict instead of a patient, a statistic instead of an individual. He was told that a lot of his pain was psychological because he had become addicted. How psychological was it when numerous X-rays, CT scans, and MRIs showed real physical damage? Some self-inflicted, certainly, but physical nonetheless. He was told to suck it up and given tools to fight addiction, nothing to prevent pain. In the eyes of the medical professionals, he became a drug seeker. Would it be natural for his body to experience pain when considering his many complications? Every day and every night he was in pain, unrelenting pain. Why was this so surprising that he should be having physical pain? After a particularly excruciating day at St. Joseph's Hospital, he came home and drank windshield washer fluid in yet another attempt to stop the hurting, as he was told he had to learn to live with it. Ken later confessed to me this was not the first time he'd attempted suicide, but nobody, not me, not his doctors, addressed this admission. In hindsight, I was in denial. After he drank the windshield washer fluid, he was in intensive care for several days. He went on dialysis, which added another layer of doctor appointments, to which we spent many hours driving. Now it felt like our life was living in a car, always on our way to this appointment or that hospital, but finally his physical symptoms were being addressed. He taught me how to drive in this city as we went to St. Joseph's Hospital, as we went to Toronto General, as we went to Queensway Trillium, as we went to Cam H, and as we went to Oakville Trafalgar Hospital, both the old and the new one. He introduced me to the underground tunnels joining the various hospitals on University Avenue. Who knew? I remember one day at Toronto General, Ken was in a wheelchair and we were in the lobby trying to make sense of the maps showing the labyrinth of rooms. It was a hot, tiring day. Ken was short-tempered, I was worse, and there we were, both trapped. Ken unable to stalk away, trapped in a wheelchair, and me unable to run, trapped in a net of fear, frustration, responsibility, and profound love for the child I was desperately trying to heal. With so many emotions overwhelming me, I had and have lost track of the days, the appointments, the doctors, the meds. I can't count the procedures, the ambulance calls, the hospital stays, the fissures in the fragile fabric of Ken's life. These trips gave us multiple opportunities to have meaningful conversations, and he became my best friend. We talked about his children, their extended family as well as ours, his broken dreams, his many, many regrets. He taught me that full-fat cheese was better than skim milk cheese, that butter was better than not, and that long, slow, and low cooking was far superior to quick, hot, and fast. He shared insights on baking bread. We talked about his garden we planted. We spoke about food preservation and canning produce. He talked about anything and everything in his life. In hindsight, maybe Ken was preserving his memories with me. I now know that all these efforts were to distance himself from the constant, never-ending pain. He put boiling water in hot water bottles and put them on his back so that the exterior pain was distracting from the interior pain. He could no longer drive, and I would take him to his Saturday job at a daycare where he did minor repairs and maintenance. That was when he used his earnings to take a taxi to the LCBO before I picked him up. He started drinking vodka disguised in water bottles. He wasn't interested in getting drunk. He wasn't having a good time. He was wanting to pass out. He couldn't sleep because of pain. He made elaborate meals at night to distract himself. He never ate the meals. He had no appetite. He became skeletal, his clothes hanging on him. I scolded him for frying bacon and waking me up with the smell which I came to abhor. I was tired, I was cranky, I was impatient. How could I have been so blind? I had more compassion and understanding for strangers than I did for Ken. Was that because I could remove myself from their situations and I wasn't somehow responsible? Here's where my guilt, my regrets, my anger become overwhelming, and I couldn't give myself the grace of understanding that we were all affected by Ken's illness emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. I am so, so very sorry. My beautiful baby boy certainly paid a high price for his moral weaknesses and imperfections as well as mine, the sins of the mother. I know the month before Mother's Day, April, the year he died, but not the date. I know the year because I was hit by another car when going to see him at the hospital. My car was a write-off and I had to get another car. My car is a 2016 model. The last week he spent in the hospital, his children, Dad, and I visited every day. One day, after being with him all day, I was leaving, bent over to give him a kiss. He wrapped his arms around me and didn't want to let go. He said, "I love you." Then in a childlike voice I'll never forget, filled with all the sadness and regret and guilt echoed in my own soul, he said, "I'm a good person, Mom." I know now that he was saying goodbye. I am so sad that I didn't know that in the moment. Hindsight is a double whammy. He and I talked about it. He never acknowledged it to his children, never acknowledged to his children that he was dying. They knew, and they never let him know that they knew. His daughter spent a week of days and nights with him without a break, then went home to shower and change her clothes. His son and I were in his room after he had been resuscitated after a code blue. He asked me to go home and get his do not resuscitate order that he had signed months before. I fearfully and tearfully left the hospital, and his son went outside for a break. We lived 5 minutes away from the new Oakville Trafalgar Hospital. I had his orders in my hand when the phone rang. Like the bell at the end of a brutal, bloody boxing match. In hindsight, I wonder if he knew. Death strikes differently. The year before my son passed, my sister's son was training for the cancer ride from Toronto to Niagara Falls. On a Sunday, about a week before the event, Ken and I were on the front deck when his cousin rode into the driveway on his bike. We had a wonderful time and they both enjoyed the pleasure of the visit, for which I will always be grateful. The next Thursday, my nephew took his sons to a rugby practice, and while they practiced rugby, he continued his bike training on the country roads nearby. The cancer ride was 2 days away. He never made it. He was hit from behind by a distracted driver and was killed instantly. He had just turned 50. I am an avid reader, and I often write out some passages that I find particularly personally moving. Sometimes I forget to write down the source. I copied this the year before my nephew's death, put it in a drawer beside my bed, and I forgot all about it. After Ken died, I came across it and gave my sister a copy. What is actually worse, years of enduring the Iron Maiden of imagining, or seconds of experiencing the quick death of knowing? In hindsight, it is quite prophetic. It spoke to both my sister's experience of losing her son and my experience of losing my son. The week after Ken's death, I had a dream. He was crouched down fiddling with some wires behind his hospital bed. He was wearing a t-shirt and track pants. They were gray. His thighs were those of a football player, full and muscular. His face was rosy and smiling. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "I have to fix these wires." I said, "You should be in bed. What about your dialysis?" And he said, "Oh, I don't need that anymore." In hindsight, I think this was Ken letting me know he was okay. Ken left a legacy. Ken was honored after his death with a permanent plaque at the high school, where he spent so many hours coaching and leading his team to a championship. His son graduated college as an energy systems technician and is engaged to marry his high school sweetheart. His daughter graduated as a laboratory technician, married a wonderful man who shares all her family values, and 2 years ago they presented us with our first great-grandchild, who is, I am unabashedly certain, the cutest and smartest child I've ever met. I remember looking out of Ken's hospital room window after he passed, watching cars go by on the street 3 stories below, and thinking, don't they know my son died? But life goes on. My husband and I, along with our first son, moved out of our Oakville home to a country home in Rockwood, Ontario. We've had 2 years of COVID isolation, but our grandchildren and daughters are frequently in touch. Now that the restrictions and vaccinations have made it easier, we are regularly visited by them with joy and lots of hugs. Our daughter in California is making arrangements for us to spend Canadian and American Thanksgiving with her and her wife. And Bill and I are thankful and grateful for our family, our life, and even our trials and tribulations. I have, by God's grace, 2 very accomplished daughters who are more than I ever was. They have met many challenges and survived. I could probably write another whole story just about them, but then it would look like I was boasting. God's grace, I am grateful to have a son who lives with us, and with him we have a very symbiotic relationship. We do for each other equally, and I discover more about him every day. He is so strong emotionally and so sensitive secretly. He sometimes projects a cavalier attitude, but internally there's a very serious, introspective man. I know that, but nobody else does. My grandchildren are all past the teenage stage and all the drama and angst that entails. Their path will not always be easy or straight, but I know they'll be fighters and survivors. The future is theirs. What have I learned? I have learned compassion, to observe but not to judge. I am not so different from other mothers. If my story does anything at all, I would advise all mothers that as you have compassion for others, also have compassion for yourself. Perhaps the most poignant lesson is that nobody else will benefit from my mistakes, but maybe they will benefit from my experience after they've made their own mistakes. It is difficult to advise our younger generations. As my mother told me, too smart, too late. Each generation needs to experience the quicksand and the mud holes, the mountains and the valleys. There are just some things we have to learn hands-on. The saving grace of learning the hard way is that we are less likely to make the mistakes twice. An ancient lament, if I knew then what I know now. In hindsight, I have not dwelt on the parts played by my husband, my daughters, my eldest son, my grandchildren. Those are their stories to tell. There is a distinct danger of putting my perception onto their reality. There is no reality, there is only perception. Shortly before this book was published, my son Dennis died of a catastrophic brain aneurysm. He was 57 years old. It was a Sunday morning. He came to our room and gave a cheery wave and a good morning, as he always did. He came back 20 minutes later, clutching his head. He fell to his knees and said, "Something is wrong, something's wrong." I called 911. He passed away minutes later before they arrived. What is actually worse? Years of enduring the Iron Maiden of imagining, or seconds of experiencing the quick death of knowing? I am grateful that I knew both sons personally as adults. I am grateful that there was nothing left unsaid. We were able to have so very many meaningful conversations. Both sons were one-of-a-kind individuals. Both contributed in unique ways. Both deaths were devastating. Both lives taught lessons. Be compassionate. Be grateful. Live each moment and never, ever take life for anything other than the most amazing, miraculous gift we will ever receive. Ken's daughter is due to deliver our second great-grandchild, a girl, in March 2023.